I am an African.
Welcome to the second episode of our China and Africa episodes with Dr. Emanuel Matambo, Research Director at the Center for Africa-China Studies at the University of Johannesburg. In this episode, we discuss big changes in Sino-African relations that shape the current political and economic nature of their relationships today. We touch on how China is evolving from its relationship with Africa from state-centric to a market-driven one by Chinese capitalists and their tensions with African entrepreneurs. We also talk about the post-COVID context by discussing China's economic slowdown and its effect on Africa, once characterized by non-interference in domestic affairs and big spending with little checks in an almost Santa Claus manner, to a more austere, stricter, and more cautious China, especially on things like debt restructuring, which often means making debt owed by poor countries more manageable, such as extending how long a country can pay back. Finally, we look at what's ahead and whether we'll see a China which will get more involved in African politics and militaries.
I am an African.
Yeah, let me just continue and touch on the issue of agency. Because when we talk about the debt trap diplomacy, there's obviously an implication that Africa has no agency and China can just do whatever it wants, and Africa will just accept it, and you just have to wait. And again, that speech by Mugabe was very interesting because he made a mockery of this assumption of no agency because he said, was it? I think it was in another speech. He was referring to them choosing China and a state visit to South Africa. I think he said, "What did you want us to do if you sanction us? Are we just going to sit here and say, in the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, and pray for someone to help us and move on and somehow develop without the West giving us everything?" And so on one hand, you see a lot of agency and Africa being able to diversify its relationship with finances, with trade, international development. I think countries like Rwanda, some other countries have been used as examples, like Sudan, especially those sanction hit countries. As you mentioned, China doesn't interfere in international relations, in domestic affairs and international affairs of other countries. And on one hand, the sort of stereotypical assumption of Western institutions was that they tell you what to do with the money and how to use it and democratize and human rights and so on and so forth, which rubs African leaders the wrong way. At the same time, you see these agreements with China that one could argue that, some of them would be very opaque, some of them wouldn't be very clear, and at the same time, because of their lack of focus on things like human rights, both, of course, you can't only blame the Chinese government, but even sort of Chinese entrepreneurs would have incidents in which they will have serious conflicts with their communities that they are investing in. I think Zambia is one of the earliest examples that is often cited when, 50 people died in a coal mine.
Zambia.
Yeah, and it was found that there were more people than was supposed to be allowed for safety, for health and safety standards in that coal mine. And there's a lack of, you don't really get that many press conferences addressing these issues from the Chinese Foreign Ministry or from entrepreneurs in the way that you sort of see in some Western countries. So would you say the lack of transparency in these deals and in these agreements and lack of sort of discussing these issues from both parties has sort of fueled these tensions? And could you just sort of expand on the general tensions that we might have seen in the past between China and Africa?
When you spoke about Robert Mugabe's speeches in 2007, in 2015, he was not actually the first person to make those pronouncements. The first person to make those pronouncements, especially to a Western audience, even Mugabe was preaching to the choir. He was preaching to a BRICS audience. In 2007, December 2007, in Lisbon, Portugal, there was a conference, a summit of the African Union and the European Union as well. The then president of Zambia, Levi Patrick Manawasa, was the first person to speak about Africa's option, so to say, to go to China. The ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe had spoken about the Look East principle, the Look East policy in 2003, but then Mwanawasa said it now to a European audience in 2007 when he said, his words were that we went to China when you, the West, abandoned us. So that is the first time when something was actually said, such a prestigious platform to a Western audience. And then coming to the opacity of agreements between Africa and China, that is one of the downsides actually to Africa's relationship with China, precisely because China is very sensitive to criticism. But then this is actually counterproductive. Why? Because when you do not come out expressly to explain something, you do not express the terms and conditions of an agreement, you're actually not protecting yourself to criticism. You're actually opening up more room to different interpretations. You're opening up more room even for your detractors to attack you, because then people would say, what is it that you are trying to protect? What is it that you are trying to, why are you leaving these agreements shrouded in mystery? So that is one of the downsides to Africa's relationship with China. Explain the terms very well to people. And I think China has been trying in as much as it can to kind of disabuse people of that notion, because these days, even when there are concessional loans, China usually says, okay, we are giving out these loans, and then these are the terms. Probably you have a grace period of 5 years, and then you'll be paying back these loans at an interest rate of about 1% or something like that. Obviously, that was not the case this year, when Zambia announced that it had reached a debt concessional agreement with China, France, and South Africa, because in as much as France was very active, it was actually in France that Zambia's president Hakainde Hichilema announced this deal. China was conspicuously quiet, and its silence on the matter attracted a lot of attention, because most of Zambia's bilateral debt, international bilateral trade, is actually owed to China. About 33%, certainly more than 30% of Zambia's bilateral trade to an international partner is owed to China. So whenever China does not come out proactively to mention exactly the terms of its trade with Africa, that is a very big downside. We would want more transparency in that, because a lack of transparency leaves interpretation, especially to the hands of people who are very effective in trying to make sure that they draw a red, they wield a red flag on China's relationship with Africa. Secondly, we have to note that because China's relationship with Africa has changed, it is now a relationship that is also driven, especially in terms of trade and investment, by the private sector in China. We also see that the private sector in China is just as brazen as other capitalist powers and other capitalist players, whilst China as a state is somehow inclined to repeat ideological underpinnings of African-China relations, to say, okay, we come from this history and we want this type of relationship.
The win-win.
Yes, the win-win diplomacy. The private sector in China is strictly based on capital mobilization, and because of that, we see that yes, sometimes adherence is not so much upheld when it comes to trade, when it comes to investment, when it comes to Chinese multinational corporations as well, because there is this brazen and naked pursuit of capital, and that to some extent makes Chinese investment and private Chinese investment to have a cavalier attitude, so to say, when it comes to labor practices in China. So that is not to be blamed on China as a state, it is to be blamed on these present capitalists of Chinese provenance.
Okay, that's interesting, because now you're brought to sort of a sub-state
Exactly.
sort of, angle to it. And that's interesting because we see many of these tensions are very, some analysts say many of the tensions are actually on an entrepreneurial basis, because, if it's not selling cheap goods that locals feel they can easily produce, or if it's not, perhaps this could be state and entrepreneurial, if it's maybe building a construction site and maybe they have to bring Chinese people to do things that maybe like bricklaying, which is very simple, doesn't require any
Exactly.
technical expertise. And I think we see a lot of tensions there. Um, so obviously now this is sort of the post-COVID era, and COVID saw what I think is beginning to see maybe a bit of a change in the way China deals with. I don't know if you could argue that as well. You could correct me if I'm wrong. There's sort of an assumption that China is becoming a bit more mature and a bit more the Father Christmas era is over, where China is just handing out billions and billions. Like, if one leader gets angry with the West, they're like, okay, no, I'm going to go to China, I'll get money. China was sort of like, it's sort of like the sugar daddy of Africa. If Africa can get something from this side, it will go to China, and granted, China will give it to them. No strings attached. But I think early on, I think that was in the between 2010 and 2015, Zimbabwe was in deep debt distress to China, and I think they wanted to finance a construction site. I think it was a road or a bridge, and China actually did something very unique. Very strange to Chinese sort of understanding of non-interference, and they wanted Zimbabwe to prove that they had a way of paying it back, and put in sort of their own officials to just verify. And then in Congo, I think there's a trend that much of the Chinese investment is moving towards private hands or entrepreneurial hands. And so are we seeing, and then also, of course, we talked about debt and loans, and you mentioned the debt relief that has been much talked about in Zambia, and Angola also is also another big one. China announced officially, I think 2021, that it's forgiving some debt for 15 African countries. But there's still sort of this assumption that, and from the China Africa Research Initiative, they said something about a property bubble, and I found it very interesting because they talked about internal debt, how provinces are internally indebted to the Chinese financial system and so on, and how Africa is finding it very hard for more debt forgiveness and debt restructuring from China. And you mentioned China was very quiet at that one. So there's a notion that China is becoming much more reluctant, and China doesn't really want to forgive debt, and China is sort of like, they're becoming much more austere in their relationship with Africa. So in short, is the Father Christmas era over? Can we not go to China anymore and just get what we want? Because there's still a lot of things to be done.
I think Father Christmas gives out gifts freely. China has never really done that, at least to any significant degree anyway. When Deng Xiaoping became the Secretary General of the Communist Party of China, and then became the president of China later on in 2013, China had entered what was called the new normal. It started in 2013, and coinciding at the same time when China came up with the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, what was the new normal? The new normal was a changing dynamic of China's internal economics. From 1978 to 2008, that period of about 30 years, and then to 2013, that period extending to 35 years, China was developing its economy at a very frenetic pace of about 9%, as I mentioned earlier. But then what happened in the interim is that about 400 million Chinese people had been lifted out of desperate poverty. So they became more demanding in terms of their labor wages. So what China decided to do was it started exporting some of its labor-intensive industries to Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Thailand, are now benefiting from industries that were historically in China. What that showed was that China's people were not only demanding, it is because they had been lifted out of poverty, a lot of them were also becoming increasingly educated, and they are now entering the service industry rather than relying on manufacturing.
I see.
So what did that say? What that entailed was that the era of China's 10% growth rate was over. It was now an era wherein China is entering the service industry, wherein growth would be lower, it would be more modest, but more durable as well, because now the people are trained, now the people are more educated. But then with that, obviously, came an impact on how much commitments China could make to its partners, especially Africa.
Right.
So when people are talking about China's reduction in terms of giving loans to Africa, that actually ended in 2013 when China acknowledged that we cannot commit to the same level that we have always committed, because now we are more we're now entering a service era in our economic makeup. So COVID only exacerbated a process that was always ongoing, that was already ongoing from 2013. So that is why what you call the for the Christmas era is gone. But then herein lies an opportunity in Africa. The Chinese character, people always talk about this, that the Chinese character for the word crisis means has opportunity inside it. So there's danger and opportunity in it as well. So there is an opportunity here for Africa. Why? Because now we have seen a China that is not frantically committed to giving Africa the economic commitments that it gave before. But then this gives us an opportunity as Africa to find ways through which our relationship with China can be more durable. Because China has realized, I mean, it was forced to seize, not really seize, maybe seize the negative way, but it was forced to take over the Hambantota Bay in Sri Lanka, to lease it for about 99 years because Sri Lanka had backward.
That was sort of paraded as the child of debt trap diplomacy, of what happens.
Exactly, as a poster child of China's debt diplomacy. And I think China realized, because of the flag that it received from it realized that no, we actually have to be more assertive in the aid that we are disabusing, we're dispersing, to Africa. And that is why Zimbabwe, for example, was told to say, okay, now give us a profile of how exactly you plan to pay back our debt. I don't think it was done with the standard gauge railway in Kenya, but then it will be done, I think, increasingly with the rest of the African continent, because China has realized that, well, we are actually receiving undue pressure, so to say, spread from our enemies when we are merely telling African countries, okay, now pay back our debt. Because most of the times when we have this appetite for debt contraction in Africa, and we are told, okay, you pay back this debt in 30 years, we usually think as if 30 years is a long time. It's not a long time in the development of a country. This happened in 1980 when Britain told Zimbabwe, just give us 20 years to withdraw from Zimbabwe. Well, 20 years came in just like that in a jiff in Zimbabwe, and Tony Blair was forced to walk back some of the initial commitments. So Africa has to show its agency, it has to show its foresight, but it also has to show responsibility in how exactly are we contracting this debt and how are we going to repay this debt. So once again, I usually put the responsibility myself on Africa rather than on China. It is very irresponsible for Africans to merely blame China. So yes, the honeymoon phase of just indiscriminately passing debt to China ended a decade ago in 2013, and COVID-19 just more like put paid to that, or was more of a shock, of a shock, because it wasn't foreseen. But then the process of China being more modest in disbursing debt to Africa could be traced even a decade ago.
No, that's profound, because that sort of seems to be what everyone is discussing now. And I think I can sort of lump two topics together building on that, to sort of conclude. Do you think there's any lessons that international development agencies can learn from how China has invested in Africa, and how China seems to have weathered the storm? There seems to be, even now, there seems to be a cognizance that, even, if you look at the trajectory, maybe there was tensions, but very few African politicians want to completely decouple from China. And even in the United States, the rhetoric around politicians of wanting to be stronger on China and move their industries away from China, very few of the big companies and multinationals want to actually leave China. So is there sort of sort of an acknowledgement that China is here to stay, and what can people learn from Chinese investment in Africa, and where do you see it going after, with the COVID pandemic and the ongoing Ukraine war, and also more Africa-centric, the sort of narrative of Africa wanting a better financial pact, better financial agreement with the world?
First of all, the moral makeup of Western diplomacy is universalist, whereas the moral makeup of China's diplomacy is cultural, is relativist. The United States, NATO, the World Bank, IMF, and there are many institutions that have under the influence of the United States usually look at their own makeup as being universal and hence has to be exported to the rest of the world. That has not really helped the Western presence in the rest of the world, because Africa is very, very touchy and irritable on issues that are really premised on interference, on issues that are really premised on preaching to Africa. Why? Because part of the reason is because the West is predominantly capitalist, and the people that had colonized the African continent were capitalist powers as well. So one of the things that the West can do is to learn the issue of partnership, is to learn the fact that it does not always have to institute this missionary zeal on preaching to Africa and the developing world. Secondly, the West, because of its Manichaean look at the world to say it's either this or that, doesn't even look at the possibilities of partnering with China on the African continent. When we talk about the issues of the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, are there any possibilities in the Belt and Road Initiative through which the United States can actually collaborate with China for the benefit of Africa?
And so sorry if I can, so just for our listeners, the Belt and Road Initiative is this massive infrastructure network that China is building to sort of rewire trade from the global south towards China.
Yes, indeed. Initially, it was actually China going towards towards Middle East, towards Eastern Europe, but now even Italy has signed on to the Belt and Road Initiative, and in Africa, obviously, it has been widely popular as well. So one of the things that the West can learn is try to make sure that it looks more diligently at possibilities of cooperation with China. This, by the way, is a lesson that South Africa itself can learn, because South Africa usually competes with China on the rest of the African continent in terms of infrastructure, in terms of investment as well. South Africa competes fiercely with China. So are there ways through which they can hunt for possibilities of cooperation with China? That is one thing that they can learn. So yes, you have to first of all admit that your own template, the Western template is not universal. The Western template should make sure that it takes into cognizance African agency. And secondly, rather than always seeing China as a pernicious player on Africa and the rest of the world, are there any possibilities of cooperation for the benefit of the West itself, for the benefit of China, and for the benefit of Africa? So those are just the two fundamentals that Africa can, that the West, can learn about China. And in Henry Kissinger's book, I think it was published in 2011, it was called On China. In the first pages of that book, he actually admits that what has been the biggest selling point on China is that it is because China is very modest. China says we have this particular diplomacy, and it is cultural diplomacy. And cultural is usually contextual. It is immanently contextual. When you have a certain culture, you say, well, this is our culture, but let us respect other people's culture. The United States, on the other side, it is like a missionary from the West. You know, when the missionaries came to Africa, they
Yeah.
told Africa, get rid of all your heathen worships. Your name is Zenge. It wouldn't qualify as a Christian name. If you were to be baptized in a church, they'll probably tell you, well, your name is John today because Zenge is a heathen name. You know, that is the missionary zeal that the West came up with. For us, we are not going to we're not going to compromise, and what we have is this template that has to be adopted by Africa, and that obviously has not worked for Africa. So those are just some of the lessons that the West can learn.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that you mentioned Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger is so for our listeners, Henry Kissinger is the Secretary of State for the United States in the 70s, and he's responsible for sort of opening up China, communist China,
Exactly.
to the West. And perhaps if Henry Kissinger was alive, was in power today, um, maybe you'd have an opinion on, as you mentioned, they're more modest, and you can see sort of some mimics. There's a partnership for global infrastructure and investment, which Joe Biden started with the G7 to sort of rival
Yeah.
Chinese infrastructure, and the European Union before COVID also talked about the global gateway.
Gateway,
So
exactly.
several billions of dollars was promised, and if you don't mind just telling us a bit about that, and do you think that they can actually compete with the Belt and Road Initiative?
Well, thank you very much for explaining, because I just threw the Henry Kissinger name there without context. So thank you very much for that. When you look at what the United States and the European Union through the global gateway have been trying to do is what I just said. This reactive kind of instinct in them. If China is doing this, we are going to do that. In 2000 and I think it was in 2011 when Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State for the United States. In her conversations with Michael Sata, the president of Zambia, she spoke about China being potentially a neo-colonial power. Mike Pompeo, who was Donald Trump's Secretary of State, was in Ethiopia. He spoke about the same as well, China being a neo-colonial power. And then you earlier on spoke about Michael Bolton. I added my bit about Bill Burr as well, talking about China in very bifurcated terms. It's either or. If the United States is a force for good, China is a force for evil.
Very
So
black and white picture.
exactly, it's strictly a black and white picture, and that is why when it comes to preferential partnerships with Africa, the West can never win if it had that kind of mentality coming to Africa, because that mentality comes to Africa proselytizing to Africa, saying, well, the Belt and Road Initiative is this, we are coming with a global gateway, and we think our template is working. But then the template that comes with a lot of strings attached to it can never work in Africa, because Africa is finding its voice. The BRICS, the three BRICS group of countries has now been expanded with an addition of Egypt and Ethiopia, very strategically placed African powers. So you can also see from there that there is the sheer numbers of African countries that took part in the 15th BRICS summit that happened a few kilometers from where I'm sitting here, in between 22nd and 24th of August this year, showed that indeed the BRICS, and China in particular, is a very popular player on the African continent. So if you want to compete with China, you cannot win based on the fact that you want to traduce China or to impugn China's presence on the African continent. So if you want to make sure that you have a foothold, a footprint on the African continent as well, you have to find some ways of trying to work with China. Remember, during COVID, at the time when Canada, for example, had more than 6 times the number of vaccines it needed, China was saying we're actually going to give Africa more than 60 million COVID vaccines. We are also going to contribute towards the construction of the Centers for Disease Control on the African continent. That was a contrast to what the West was trying to do. So if the West, exactly, holding vaccines, trying to introduce China at the same time. It cannot work like that because China, Africa today can actually see through what is happening. It can actually go for what it thinks is of benefit to Africa. So I don't see the global gateway. Even up to today, if you ask even an no, not really an ordinary African. I think it would be unfair to ask an ordinary African even about the Belt and Road Initiative. A lot of them would not have an idea on that. But even if you ask students of international politics today, you ask them about the Belt and Road Initiative, at least a lot of them would have an idea of what you're talking about. But if you ask them about the global gateway, they would not have an idea of what you're talking about. And that just shows the popularity of China compared to the West. And it is because the West usually looks at politics and international diplomacy in black and white color forms, and Africa does not.
Yeah. Okay. So, if you don't mind, I'm going to squeeze the last question,
No
and
problem.
then we will conclude. And so I think what we're seeing now, we see China's foothold in Africa is there, and it looks like it's probably going to be there to stay, and it's now a serious player. And Africa, as you said, is also finding its voice. But what we also see now is, and what many people perhaps haven't really discussed, is China's increasing political and military involvement. We have seen Chinese military base in Djibouti, and we have seen sort of CCTV and sort of police training in Uganda with China. And of course, I think China has also been involved in some sort of changes of power in Zimbabwe. And in other continents, in the Middle East, China is involved in the political discussions between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So, what future do we see for China beyond sort of this trade and economic relationship with Africa? And are we going to see increasing Chinese sort of interference in African diplomacy or African domestic politics?
Actually, to be frank, Zenge, Africa's relationship with China has never been strictly trade-related. Actually, trade forms a component of Africa-China relations, and it gets more attention because it is easily seen. You see a Chinese bank on the corner of your street, or you see a Chinese construction site and stuff like that. But it was very minimal starting from the time in 1956 when China had relations with Egypt up to 1998. So China has always been politically involved in Africa, by the way. In South Africa, from 1994 to 1998, apartheid South Africa still had relations with Taiwan rather than China. Nelson Mandela wanted that to remain the case, but then also to have the relationship with China. And China told him, no, we do not compromise with that. It's either Taiwan or us. And he was forced to renounce relations with Taiwan in favor of China. And in 1998, South Africa had relations with China. To make sure that that was fortified. FOCAC happened into the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation came into existence in the year 2000. It was yes, it had a trade component to it, but it also had a political component to it because China wanted continue to support at the United Nations as well, and Africa also wanted the buffer, so to say, from Western censure, Western tutelage, and Western sanctions as well. So there has always been a political component to China. In excuse me, in the year 2006, when Zambia was going for an election, Michael Sata, who was the main opposition in Zambia, campaigned almost exclusively on an anti-China platform. And Li Baodong, who was the Chinese ambassador to Zambia at the time, told the Associated Press that if Michael Sata wins this election, China will have nothing with Zambia. That was the present threat, and it was an indirect reference to say we are actually have a preference of who can be president and who cannot be president. So that was interference on China's involvement, at least on Zambia's politics on China. So the political component has always been there. It is with us right now, and it will always continue because remember, when you have a stake in a country, an economic stake in a country, you want to have an idea of what that country is doing. It happened in 2021 when Zambia won its election, when the United Party for National Development in Zambia beat the incumbent Patriotic Front to win an election. And a lot of people thought, okay, maybe the incoming government is going to be more assertive on China. That was not the case. The first diplomat that the incoming president at the time, Hakainde Hichilema, received was actually the Chinese ambassador. He went to him and they spoke about last month. In September, the president of Zambia, the seventh president of Zambia, Hakainde Hichilema, went to China and upgraded China's relationship with China, Zambia's relationship with China. So you can see all this, that trade is important. It forms a very significant component, but it is not the only component. China will continue to have some political influence, subtle, yes, not really present, but some sort of political influence on the African continent, and that will continue even into the future, because it is, and it is only understandable because China has a very big stake on Africa, and it wants to see where exactly Africa is going and whether or not the political systems that are current in Africa are political systems that will support Africa's economic viability and thus also the recouping of China's debt in Africa.
Excellent. Yeah. No, I think that's a good way to sort of close it off there. And just want to give a shout out to your book launch for those that are listening and that are particularly interested in China-Africa studies. His institute at the University of Johannesburg just released it's called the Quest of Unity.
The Quest for Unity. An appraisal of regional integration in Africa. It will be launched on the 1st of November.
All right. Okay. So there you have it. The Quest of Unity. It's going to be exploring China-Africa relations. It's from the University of Johannesburg. And today, of course, we have our incredible guest, Dr. Emanuel Matambo, who is the research director at the University of Johannesburg Center for Africa-China Studies. This has been your episode on China and African relations. We have covered a very extensive mixture of events and fields in China and African relations. Dr. Matambo, we want to thank you very much for being here on our podcast, and hopefully we'll see you again, because this relationship is evolving and evolving and evolving. And yeah, we're very happy to have had you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation. I will now be a fervent follower of Africa for Dummies. The name is quite exciting. So
yeah. Yeah, so most people often end up finding out that it's not really, they're not really that dumb, but you're supposed to live much more enlightened about the continent. And so yeah, of course, so for those listening, of course, make sure you just leave us a 5-star rating, follow us, share, and engage with us. We want to hear what you want to listen to, what you want to see, interact with us, follow us on our different pages. And of course, we just want to thank our guests once again. We want to thank you for listening to us wherever you are. So this is Africa for Dummies, and thank you.
When I say I am an